One of the biggest mistakes that I see people make in QuickBooks Online is treating the bank feed as if it is a checklist of the bookkeeping that needs to be done in their business. And to be honest, I get where this misconception comes about. When you first log into QuickBooks and connect your bank feed, it's really encouraging to see transactions automatically flowing through. And it's really easy to assume that if you just add and categorize those transactions, that you're automatically working through things in the correct way. But that ignores the greater ecosystem that is at play in a QuickBooks Online file, because the bank feed is just part of the tool that is used to make our lives a little bit easier. It greatly cuts down on data entry, but all by itself, it actually isn't a full accounting cycle or workflow. In order to best illustrate this, we're going to have to travel back about a decade to when accounting was a much more manual job. What used to happen is we would manually enter invoices, we would manually enter bills, and then we would record either the customer payments that came in or the vendor payments that went out. Then, after all of that accounting work was done, we would take the statement at the end of every month, compare it to our bank register, and manually add any transactions that weren't already recorded there. This basically was the reconciliation process, and it served as a double check. But ultimately what was happening is every single transaction that was in our accounting file was there because somebody had sat down and manually provided the date the transaction took place, who was being paid, the dollar amount, and the expense or income account that should be associated with that transaction. The bank feeds have drastically changed this. We don't have to do all those manual steps anymore, but we still need to understand how the bank feed plays into the greater accounting cycle that is happening within our books. So ultimately, what has changed? Well, now information is flowing through from our financial institutions in close to real time. This is phenomenal. And since it automatically provides us with things like the date, the dollar amount, who was being paid, we can then just fill in the expense or income category and move on. But we have to understand that if we're using our QuickBooks file in a holistic way, we still have to recognize those other elements that are taking place. So for example, if I sent an invoice to a customer and then they paid it, have I already recorded that and am I ready to match it with the transaction that's coming through my bank feed? Or is this something where I need to be aware and watch and match up as things come along? So we still need to know what's going on in our file, and we still need to know what information we might be missing. But the bank feed allows us to now much more quickly and easily go through and add transactions that hadn't yet been accounted for. So the first step when we're looking through our bank feeds is to identify whether or not there are transactions already recorded in QuickBooks that the bank feed is basically just corroborating. If this is the case, we do need to match or pair those transactions accordingly. Otherwise, we run the risk of duplicating transactions that should only show up on our books once. For example, if we have sent an invoice to a customer and then the customer pays us and we classify that transaction as income in our bank feed, we've kind of done ourselves a disservice here, because not only are we technically declaring that income twice, but we're also showing that that invoice hasn't yet been paid. And if we're sending statements or other things to our customers, they're showing that the customer owes us more money than they really do. This means that a whole variety of our reports will not be accurate, and it puts us at a disadvantage when it comes to running our business. The next task that bank feeds accomplish is the fact that they allow us to much more quickly and easily enter information that has not already been entered as part of another accounting workflow. So let's take out accounts payable and accounts receivable, and let's assume that everything got matched up nicely and we're all set there, okay? If we had other transactions flowing through our accounts that weren't necessarily part of that, like a run to Staples where we used our business debit card, or a run to Costco, anything like that, we are getting some baseline information from our financial institution, and we can just provide the missing income or expense account and get that transaction added onto our books. The other wonderful thing is that when we are working through this process and when we are matching things up with accounts payable and accounts receivable, classifying the remaining transactions, and then going through and reconciling our accounts to our bank statements, we have lots of double checks in place, but we also actually expedite the process of reconciling, because if a transaction came through our bank feed, QuickBooks knows with a high degree of certainty that it actually did occur, and therefore it can mark it off automatically for you, which is really lovely. Again, the reconciliation process used to be a much more manual process. We would actually have to manually, physically check off every single transaction that happened on our books and that we saw on our statements. This is vastly different, and it has made the overall workflow a lot easier as long as you understand the other processes that surround it. The biggest place that people get into trouble is automatically assuming that if a transaction shows up in their bank feed, it needs to be added to their QuickBooks Online file. That's not necessarily the case depending on what other elements of your QuickBooks workflows you are using. If you are sending invoices to your clients, you might not need to classify a transaction from your bank feed. You might want to match it with an existing invoice or an existing payment on your books. Same with a bill from a vendor. If you have entered a bill from a vendor and then you pay it via ACH and that is coming through on your bank feed, you might want to be matching that transaction up instead of classifying it as an expense. So it's definitely a good idea to work through your bank transactions tab in a certain order. You want to find all of the matches and pairs that are available first, and then work through to classifying the rest of the information. At the end of the day, I find it helpful to think of the bank feed as evidence that a transaction happened, not necessarily the transaction itself. I'm always going to want to look at my QuickBooks Online file and find out if there is a transaction already recorded that corresponds to the transaction coming through the bank feed. And the important thing to remember too is that while QuickBooks has made strides in its ability to match up transactions as they are flowing through on your books, it is not always going to get it right. So it's not uncommon if multiple, say, bills are paid at the same time for QuickBooks to have some trouble identifying the fact that two transactions are now linked to a single transaction when it comes through on your bank feed. Okay, let's say that you had two bills from a vendor, one for $1,000, one for $2,000. Well, if you sent out a $3,000 payment, QuickBooks isn't automatically going to realize that those two individual bills make up that $3,000 payment that went out. So knowing what is happening behind the scenes, knowing what you have done and how it might impact your books is really, really critically important. Bank feeds are one of the most powerful and effective tools at your disposal if you're using QuickBooks Online or another accounting software. They have drastically cut down on the data entry that is necessary to complete our books and to get our records up to date. They've also allowed us to take advantage of automation that simply wasn't an option 10 or 15 years ago. We can create rules for recurring transactions that help us classify things even more quickly going forward. But it's really important to understand that the bank transactions tab is part of the overall workflow. In fact, it's kind of the final step. You have to be walking through the full accounts payable and accounts receivable processes in order for what is showing up in your bank feed to truly be what has to be classified. So understanding the entire ecosystem is still incredibly important. Once you understand the role that bank feeds play in our data entry process, all of the other options that come along with them, splitting transactions or matching things up or pairing transactions that are happening in multiple bank feeds, all start to make a little bit more sense. So I will be putting out a video about all of the different options for classifying transactions in your bank feed and when it is most appropriate to use each one. So please do like and subscribe so that you'll be notified when that comes out. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Holly from Accrual Mistress Bookkeeping and Consulting. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you have a lovely day.